the University of Bristol in United Kingdom. Tariq Modood was born in Karachi, Pakistan, and came to Britain as a boy in 1961. He grew up in Brent, London, and studied at the University of Durham and Swansea. From 1998 on, he has been professor of sociology, politics, and public policy, and the founding director of the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship at the University of Bristol. He has 14 co-authored or co-edited books and over 75 articles or chapters on political philosophy, sociology, public policy, and other areas. His work has increasingly focused on the British Asian Muslims, the politics of being Muslim in Britain and in the West in general, and its relations to the theory and politics of secular multiculturalism. Very challenging subject, and which is very also closely related to the entire subject of the activities of our institute. He was an advisor to the Commission on the Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain between 1999 and 2000, which produced the PAREC report and advises political parties and government departments and NGOs, and he is a trustee of the Young Foundation. He is a regular contributor to the media and the policy debates. He was awarded an MBA for Services and Social Sciences and Ethnic Relations in the year 2001, and he was elected a member of the Academy of Social Sciences in 2004. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Modood.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased, in fact honored, to be here, and I thank the organizers for their invitation and giving me the opportunity to address you. Is someone going to move the slides? How do? Okay, or if you put it here, I can, you know, but yeah. I've got a memory stick. Let's say plans. While that's getting ready, maybe I can make a start. So as you can see, the talk is entitled 4 Modes of Integration. When that comes on, you'll see that I slightly changed the title to Multiculturalism and Integration, Struggling with Confusions. Now, the reason I did that is, firstly, because one of the things I want to argue is that multiculturalism is a mode of integration. So it's one of the 4 modes of integration. And the subtitle, Struggling with Confusions, is because I think there is a lot of confusion about what multiculturalism is and it isn't. And what I wanted to do in this talk, though it's best if I do it with the slides, is to offer 2 things. One is some clarity about how we should understand multiculturalism, and secondly, some advocacy, because I am an advocate of multiculturalism. Now, you might throw your head in your hands with despair at that point, because multiculturalism is supposed to be dead, it's supposed to have utterly failed, and so on. But my view is that actually the politicians who've made those speeches are not talking about multiculturalism, and to be quite honest, they've never spelt out what they do understand by multiculturalism. So I'm going to leave their views to one side, but offer my view, but partly in order to clarify what multiculturalism means, so we can have a coherent concept and see its relations with what one might call alternative policy concepts, with its competitor concepts. The 4 modes of integration that I have on a nice slide are called... Yeah, okay, if we go to the next one. Yeah, great. So these are the 4 modes of integration. I won't read them out, but the important thing I'd like to say before proceeding further about integration. Now, sometimes when we talk about integration, of course, we're talking about integration into a particular area of social life. For instance, the labour market. We're talking about how to get people integrated into the labour market or into a particular neighbourhood. I call that sectoral integration, i.e. it's just a sector of society that we're talking about. And that's not what I'm going to be talking about, because I think that integration involves a sense of membership and belonging to something, you know, like society or a country. And that's best understood in terms of the concept of citizenship. So I'm not going to be talking about how to achieve integration in a particular sector, but how to understand integration and, above all, different ways that we might pursue integration. And each of these ways has some merit, but the other modes try and address also some defects of any one mode. Maybe we could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So citizenship. Well, I hope you'll all agree that liberty, equality, and fraternity, as we had at the French Revolution, or we might now think of inclusivity or unity for fraternity, that these are the core concepts of democracy, specifically liberal democracy. I think they are the core concepts, and I want to say that the 4 modes of integration are best understood in terms of the key democratic concepts of liberty, equality, and unity. Each of the modes of integration can be understood as interpretations of these 3 democratic concepts, but also the limitations of each mode of integration can also be understood in terms of some kind of deficit, some kind of flaw in relation to liberty, equality, and fraternity. So I'll begin with the first mode of integration, namely assimilation. And obviously, I have to be very brief to cover all 4. So with assimilation, I hope this will be self-evident, difference is seen as a problem because it can lead to discrimination and conflict in society. So the solution then is, let's make everybody the same and treat everybody the same with the same rights. Okay, that's clearly an interpretation of equality. Moreover, assimilation normally works with a strong homogeneous national identity. That's clearly an interpretation of fraternity or unity. But what about freedom? What is the assimilation view of freedom? Well, what it does offer is freedom from minority difference. So one of the things that national assimilation policies can help to do is to free individuals from their communities or the pressures from their communities to be different. Well, that's good, but what about freedom to be different? What about freedom to be what you want to be, who you think you are? Obviously, assimilation has no space for that because it's trying to erase difference. So it clearly is defective when it comes to freedom. It's got freedom from minority communities, but it hasn't got freedom to be different. Moreover, what about equality? I don't think assimilation has a very strong concept of equality, because even though it promises same treatment and same rights, it actually divides citizens up into two bodies. One body is regarded as the norm, the normal, or the majority, or the host society. And the other citizens are regarded as people who have to become like the norm. So we have two different bodies of citizens with different rights and responsibilities. These people don't have to do anything except possibly display their normality so that these people can learn how to copy it, how to become like the others. So these are two differential notions of citizenship within a single body. That's not equality. So assimilation has something going for it, something good going for it, but it clearly also has some defects, which the second mode of integration tries to address. It tries to improve on assimilation. So this one I call individualist integration. And instead of having one way of change, these people becoming like this body, integration, this mode of integration recognizes that change has to be two-way. The majority society, too, has to make changes. Above all, it has to make society and its institutions inclusive. That usually requires active anti-discrimination, legislation and policies and agencies, especially in relation to socioeconomic inclusivity and equality. Moreover, this mode of integration, unlike assimilation, is not difference blind, because in order to identify inequality, like let's say racial inequality, you have to identify people by certain categories, by ethnic identities or racial categories, and at a later date you have to use the same categories to see, have your policies achieved the equality that you were trying to achieve. So in order to address equality, you have to identify the grounds of discrimination: color, national origin, some racial stereotype, whatever it is. You can't be blind to it. You must identify it because your policy targets it. Moreover, especially in Britain, but I think in Western Europe more generally, we've moved from racial equality, or not moved from it, we've extended racial equality to include religious equality. And there is a notion of unity in this mode of integration, which is a national, liberal, democratic citizenship. But difference is presumed to be negative, something that the dominant majority imposes, because what you're trying to do is to lift off the dominant society's stereotypes upon individuals. And so difference is only understood in this negative way of protecting individuals from the stereotypes that majority society puts upon them. And at the same time, in this mode of integration, difference is made private. People are told, well, of course, you may do that in your own community, or in the mosque, or in your own families, in your own homes, but we don't want to have it in the public space. Well, that's not a very positive attitude to difference. So the next mode of integration, yes, this one, cosmopolitanism, works with a positive notion of difference. And because it says, well, actually, the everyday experience of mixing and changing, where people are interacting with each other all the time, that where people respect each other's difference, but also share it and borrow from each other and just change over time. This is a positive way of appreciating difference. And on this view, no one is to be defined by their origins. They're not to be defined by the majority society, the stereotype way of defining difference, but nor are they to be defined by their community. Cosmopolitanism wants freedom both from the majority society's impositions, but also freedom from community pressure, from one's own community, from co-ethnics, co-religionists, and so on. Instead, it celebrates new and multiple identities because it says we're all changing. Don't just ask the minority to change, or don't ask any particular person to change. We should all be willing to change as we mix with other people and learn from other people. We become a new society, a new community. All that is very attractive. Certainly I find it attractive, but you see that the slide ends with a big but. Because there are problems with this idea of cosmopolitanism, or what some people call multiculture. And the problem is that some people in society, some people, not everybody, but some people, have stronger identities than cosmopolitanism can cope with. Because cosmopolitanism works very well with people who feel their identities, they can be mixed, they can be diluted, they can be temporary. People who feel they have multiple identities. People say, oh, you know, I'm a chartered accountant in my office, I'm a dad when I get home, I'm a football coach when I'm working with the local team, and I'm a Muslim when I go to the mosque. But there are other people who don't have that view about themselves. There are other people who rank their identities, who say, and this is something my research in Britain has found all the time in relation to Muslims, that Muslims say they are Muslims, regardless of context. They say there are other things as well. Obviously, no one says, I'm just a Muslim. For instance, they say they're British. They're very proud to be British. But being a Muslim is not just like being a chartered accountant or being a football coach or supporting a particular TV program. Some identities carry much more weight than others. People are not willing to let go of them. Rather, they want the other identities of their lives to organize around one or two key identities. So we have organizing identities or master identities. And cosmopolitanism can't cope with that. In any case, if we just put multiculturalism and integration to one side, we know that there are other identities in societies that can be very important. Economic identities. People organize around their worker identities in trade unions and in political parties. People organize around economic interests as, you know, capitalists or business people and so on. People organize around gender. In Britain, we have lots of people organizing around Scottishness. So if all these identities can be important, then why can't the identities that migrants and second and third generations also introduce into societies like Britain, Germany, France, and so on? Allowing people to organize on the basis of their own identities rather than asking them to privatize them can actually give people the power and the confidence to participate as equals in society as a whole. And so those sets of limitations of the cosmopolitan mode of integration, though it clearly is attractive in other ways, brings me to the last mode of integration, because it recognizes the multi is important, because people have very different views about their identities. I say here different bases of identities, because for some people, as I've just explained, their faith can be very important. For other people, color. The suffering, the historical suffering based on color racism has defined a lot of people from which they take pride, and they don't just want to shake that off. National origins are obviously important to some other people. And people have different kinds of identities. For some people, say black people in Britain, standing up when other black people experience racism is regarded as one of the things black people should do, stand up for each other against racism. But as you heard in my introduction, I'm from a Pakistani family. A lot of Pakistani families believe in order to be a real Pakistani, you have to marry a Pakistani. It's not enough just standing up for other Pakistanis in a political context. That's a much stronger idea of what it is to be a member of a community. So my point is simply that we have different bases of identities, we have different kinds of identities, different claims made by people upon members of their communities and so on. And that none should be privatized against their will. Of course, if people say, look, I know I'm a Pakistani, but, you know, don't lay on me what it is to be a Pakistani or what you think it is to be a Pakistani. Fine. But if there are some Pakistani people who say, look, this is what it means to be a Pakistani. This is how living together, respecting and honoring parents and extended family, this is what it means, then why can't that too be part of our society? Why does that have to be, as it were, made secondary to the celebration of multiple identities? So that leads us to equal respect for all kinds of identities, including ones we don't ourselves want to share. And I think that can lead to, in politics, informal and formal representation, which, of course, is one of the ideas of multiculturalism. But multiculturalism, too, has its difficulties. And I mentioned some of them here. Some of them will be very familiar to you. Our newspapers are full of them, more or less on a daily or weekly basis. Of course, on certain interpretations, not on mine, but on certain interpretations, multiculturalism can lead to inward-looking communities, communities that are mutually suspicious of each other, therefore breeding conflict. And therefore, in Britain and actually throughout the European Union, community cohesion, using slightly different vocabulary and locally, is being put into practice to address some of these difficulties, but also, and this is the bit I want to emphasize and close on, that we also have to emphasize the importance of the national. So this is my last slide, because I think that national identity is actually very important to multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is incomplete without a national identity. But what kind of national identity? Because not any kind of national identity will do. It's got to be a national identity which is not just compatible with multiculturalism, but which I would say embraces the multicultural. So it mustn't be top down. It must come from people themselves, not from governments, from chancellors, presidents, and prime ministers. It mustn't be stigmatizing. It mustn't say, oh, we are the true nationals, you are guests. We accept you, but, you know, don't disrupt our national identity. That's not the kind of national identity I'm talking about. It must be rather inclusive, plural, and forward-looking. What I mean by forward-looking is, of course, that any country has its history. I mean, we can't do without that, and I wouldn't suggest that any country should try to. And national identities clearly have been formed over time, so they have a historical character. And therefore, in a sense, you could say they're backward-looking, i.e. they've been formed in the past. I'm saying that national identity should also be forward-looking as well as backward-looking. We should be thinking about what kind of a society we are today and what kind of a society we are developing into tomorrow. That too should be embraced and made a part of our national identity. Why do I think national identity is a critical part of multiculturalism? Because even though I said to you that the central concept of multiculturalism is citizenship, and citizenship itself, of course, is about belonging, therefore fraternity, I realize that for most people, most of the time, citizenship is a rather dry concept, something to do with passports and rights and voting once every 5 years. And therefore, of course, when we think about our countries, nearly all of them anyway, we have blended a national identity into a citizenship. We have, in effect, created national citizenships. And that gives us, as a people, that gives us something more emotional and imaginative than merely constitutions and citizenship understood in terms of rights and entitlements. And I think, so in a way, this is what I'm arguing for, that multiculturalism is not against these other modes of integration. Rather, it, in some senses, embraces them all, encompasses them all, because it meets the defects, the deficits of the other modes of integration in terms of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But this multiculturalism I'm talking about is very much a multiculturalized national sense of belonging. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You are very punctual. But before letting you go, perhaps there will be questions.
Of course. Yes, of course.
First question will come from me. Now that I have the microphone. During the previous meetings, a German scholar, when we were discussing the statement made by Chancellor Merkel that the multiculturalism has failed or was not successful in Germany, and that scholar who delivered a lecture here said that rather than multiculturalism, we favor interculturalism. Of course, since these notions are new, concepts are new, there may be various definitions of it. Interculturalism, from his explanation, I understand that there may be several cultures in the society, rather than multiculturalism, which has to be in one person, could belong to several cultures, as you mentioned in your lecture also. Interculturalism is, there's another culture in the society, he should be there, stay there, and there may be additional cultures. There should be good relations between these or several cultures. Is it the way you understand, or do you want to elaborate on the comparison between multiculturalism and interculturalism?
Yes, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, you began with Chancellor Merkel. I mean, I don't speak or read German, but having seen some translations of her speech reported by European newspapers, I mean, I've no idea what she means by multiculturalism. I suppose if I had to say what I thought she was talking about, I would call it something like guest worker apartheid. I mean, it's certainly not multiculturalism. And I suppose I'd have to say, given what I mean by multiculturalism, that Germany is trying to move from pre-multiculturalism to post-multiculturalism without any multiculturalism in between. So, but interculturalism, yeah, I'm afraid I'm not an enthusiast for interculturalism. Because again, it is such a lightweight concept. It's got hardly any content whatsoever. The only thing I heard you say was that people say, oh, multiculturalism is about people sticking to their own culture, interculturalism is about mixing. Well, who said multiculturalism is about sticking to your own culture? No one offers any quotation. They don't point to a scholar, they don't point to a theorist, they don't point to a public intellectual, they don't point to a political speech, they don't point to a policy. It is a sheer caricature to say that multiculturalism is about sticking to your own culture. So, of course, if you begin with that view of multiculturalism, yes, then we need an alternative. And so, sadly, the Council of Europe and UNESCO has come to the view that interculturalism is the progressive alternative to multiculturalism. But it's only if you begin with the caricature of multiculturalism. I think that most things that people mean by interculturalism, when I say people, I mean the authors that I've read and the UNESCO and the Council of Europe's report on interculturalism, they can comfortably be included within multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is a far more deeper democratic concept than something superficial like interculturalism. That's why I tried to explain to you that multiculturalism is part of a broad democratic theory of ideas. It's not just a policy label.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Allow me to comment on this. First of all, Mrs. Merkel, she said, she made a reference to multiculti, not to multiculturalism. Multiculti was such a promotion of one political party or more political parties, meaning that everything is put together in a big pot. Why don't you talk about pluralism, cultural pluralism? As we are living in a diversity of cultures, and there is a pluralistic approach. Interculturalism is a concept of dialogue between cultures, and not each citizen is prepared to this direct. And nowhere in international talks the concept of cultural pluralism is mentioned. Why?
Thank you for the clarification about Chancellor Merkel and multiculti. I mean, I take it, of course, that the Chancellor, when she uses a certain vocabulary in a high-profile speech, she'll have some idea how people will understand her, how her own people will understand her, how the media will understand her, and so on. So if there is some fine distinction between multiculti and multiculturalism, good, but I think she should have taken some effort to make sure she wasn't misunderstood. And someone of her seniority who doesn't make the effort to not be misunderstood, I think, they're as bad as everything I've said about them. So, dialogue. Well, dialogue is one of the central concepts of multiculturalism. You see, people talk about multiculturalism, but as I said right at the very beginning, what do you mean? I'm trying to explain what I mean, and if you want further guidance, the political theorists that I'm drawing on are people like Charles Taylor, Will Kimlicka, Bhikkhu Parekh. I mean, here is a body of ideas. Cultural pluralism, well, yeah, that's just a nice term, isn't it? In a way, I would ask you, what have I said about multiculturalism that doesn't meet with your description of cultural pluralism? So I'm trying to offer a systematic idea which is related to other modes of integration, so we can have a conceptual framework, an analytical framework, so we can see how different modes of integration relate to each other, so that we don't get lost in political rhetoric, especially negative caricatures about policy positions that for one reason or another we don't like. So if someone says to me, I have read the best literature on multiculturalism or the best policies or whatever, it doesn't have to be overly intellectual, and these are the limitations that I've found, intended or unintended, these are the effects, and here is another idea, cultural pluralism, which does everything that's worthwhile in multiculturalism while escaping from its negatives, I'd say yes, okay, but that's not the kind of exchange that is taking place at the moment. People are dismissing multiculturalism without saying what they mean by it. And I don't want to just pick on the government of this country. I mean, my own Prime Minister is a prime example as well.
Professor Tariq, thank you very much for your talk. I have actually two questions. One of them is related to what you referred to as the social responsibility of the minority and the majority within a country. You said that when we have a minority within a country, they are supposed to do all the job to feel that they are integrated within a majority. And then in order to get into the process of normality, that's what you refer to as normality. Well, don't you think that that process itself is what failed in Europe, and that's why many European countries said that multiculturalism failed in Europe, because there are a lot of minority immigrants who actually don't want to integrate, don't want to do this, don't want to go through the process of normality, and they don't want to do the effort to feel that they are part of the majority. And probably, I think here we get the conflict between the majority and the minority. And that leads me to the second question is, when you said that there are some cultural identities that carry more in them than others. And you said that there are some stronger identities than others. What do you think happens when we have both the majority and the minority have stronger identities and strong feeling of identity? Are we talking here about conflict, or what happens when a case of both majority is reluctant to give up its sense of identity, and the minority also does not want to give up that? Thank you.
Yeah. So your first part of your question was referring to something I said under the idea of assimilation, namely that the minority is expected to fit in, to become normalized. But of course, I wasn't advocating that. I was stating, I was unpacking the concept and then showing its limitations and moving on to a better mode of integration that didn't put that burden solely on minorities. Then you went on to say that some people believe that some minorities don't want to integrate. I just don't see the evidence for that. No one's come up with any evidence. Certainly as far as Britain's concerned, it couldn't be further from the truth. Whether we look at neighborhoods, jobs, schools, politics, cultural life, I mean, who is it that doesn't want to integrate? Or
there are immigrants who spend more than 40 years in a country and they haven't even learned the language.
yeah, okay, that's a fact, but you were giving a causal account. See, the fact is they don't speak the language of the country they're in, and they've been there 40 years. And there aren't many such people, but there are some, okay? So the question now is, how has that come about? And some people use the language of they don't want to integrate, they self-segregate and so on, which is a causal account, i.e. they haven't integrated because they have done A, B, and C, and they have failed to do X, Y, and Z. So that's when I say, where's the evidence for the A, B, and C, and for the failure of X, Y, and Z? Now, if you ask me how come we in Britain have some neighborhoods which are, let's say more than 50% ethnic minority, and sometimes even one particular minority, like say Pakistanis, it's a multi-factor account. But one of the factors you'd have to take into account is that people moved to that neighborhood because cheap housing was available when they arrived. As it were, they set up base. Other people who came later, some of whom may be kin, some of them who may be co-ethnics, also moved in that neighborhood so that they could mutually support each other. You'd have to take into account the discrimination ethnic minorities face in not being able to move in other places when they're not, when accommodation is not let to them. You'd have to also take into account what we call, borrowing an American expression, white flight. If white people move away from a certain neighborhood because they think that neighborhood is declining, that neighborhood is no longer comfortable for them, or that neighborhood is stigmatized, then if white people move away from me, I'm standing here with, let's say, my brothers and sisters, and white people move away from me, then they look back and they say, hey, you guys have segregated. I say, yeah, I'm segregated because you moved away. That's not self-segregation. So, I mean, that's why I say, where is the evidence for the causal account? That there are certain factual situations we might agree on. But it doesn't follow from that that the minorities are to blame for the situation. In fact, the majority are more numerous, have more power and more opportunities. How could we possibly leave them out of the explanation?
I will take other questions only in case His Excellency, the former Prime Minister of Iceland, authorizes us to take more questions. Otherwise, I will stop here and move.
Please take more questions.
That's very kind.
One or two, because
It's a very interesting discussion.
Okay, fine. In this case, let's begin with His Excellency, the former Foreign Minister of Bahrain.
Yes, my question is how this national identity would be applied to a tribal country. Take, for example, Afghanistan. If you ask a Pashtun who is, he will say, well, I am a Pakistani for the last 64 years. I am a Muslim for the last 1400 years. But I am a Pashtun for the last 2000 years. So he's more a Pashtun than anything else. And in fact, I've seen in some of these countries that drivers will drive not on the road, but on the side of the road where it is not paved. And he said, well, that's a government road. Here I'm free to drive because nobody is, I'm not accountable to anybody. How would you do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, multiculturalism is really being developed, and the whole, views about integration, all four of them, have really been developed to account for a specific historical phenomenon or case, namely the post-war migration into, countries of the North, developed economies of Western Europe, North America, Australia, by people of non-European origin. Some people do have a wider concept of multiculturalism. On the whole, I think they're mistaken in trying to stretch a concept to make it work beyond its, where it works. It's a bit like, you're nodding, so I can see you understand. It's a bit like if you grow a plant in a particular garden and someone says, but my country's got a desert, how will I grow that plant in my country? I'd have to say, well, turn your country into a garden, and then you can have a bit of the cutting from my plant and try and grow it. So I'm not standing here saying I can solve, you give me any difficult case and I can solve it. That's not what I'm trying to sell.
Thank you very much. For respect to the extent of the time, I will take one more question and stop there because I don't think that we have the right to encroach to his time. Let's take the question from behind.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I actually wanted to mention one of the causes. As a case study, Holland. After the Second World War, where a lot of migrants were from Morocco and Turkey, a lot of them were actually selected because they were analphabetic, like they were not educated. And that had some problems with integration. That's one of the causes. Let's say the first generation. The second, and nowadays the third generation of that first generation, has an identity crisis. Because let's say they are not Moroccan within the country of Holland, but once they go to Morocco, they don't feel Moroccan as well. How do you see that, and how do you feel the national identity in that context?
Yeah, that's a very good point. A lot of people who came to work in the rebuilding the shattered economies of Western Europe, and in those days obviously there was the Iron Curtain, were people who really were just wanted for manual work. Even if they had other qualifications, that manual work was the only thing that was being offered to them. So I agree with you, as indeed any sociologist would have to, that we would have to look at what sociologists and economists call human capital, what people bring with them in terms of skills, qualifications, and so on. I think that that does make certain kinds of integration more difficult. Not at all impossible or anything, but it is noticeable that if we look at it, the scene internationally, that the countries that seem to have the least problems, if we talk about Western countries or Western origin countries having least problems with non-European origin migrants in large numbers, countries like Canada and Australia I'm thinking of, they are highly selective in terms of who they choose. Western Europe was far less selective, for its own economic reasons. But Canada and Australia, lots of people who can come into Britain, well, perhaps not now, we've changed the law recently, but let's say 10 years ago, couldn't get into Canada because you have to meet, occupational and educational criteria in Canada, which are of a very high standard. Then you went on to say, well, what if then the second and third generation have a kind of identity problem, identity crisis? Now, of course, there will be some kinds of, identity issues. My goodness, I've had them. So I certainly wouldn't want to say nothing like that ever happens. But I wouldn't say they are in any way inevitable. And again, I think I wouldn't want to see the scale exaggerated. The scale only becomes a real problem for the individuals, for their communities, and for society as a large, where people, like people of Moroccan origin in your example, are being rejected by the society that they want to be part of. That really does create a problem. If you think, despite your parents or grandparents being Turkish or Moroccan or something, that you are German, and you'd like to be German, and you want to be just treated like a German of your age group and your gender and so on. But people keep thinking of you as a foreigner. That's going to create an identity crisis. And that kind of identity wound actually, I think, is more serious than simply what one might call the identity evolution or the identity transition. So then some people react by embracing the other pole. So then they become, you know, very ethnic or very religious or very whatever the minority identity is. And this is very much a reactive identity and an oppositional identity. And perhaps one of the best examples of that we've seen in the 20th century is the African American kind of black power identity. And I think that some of the political assertiveness that we've seen amongst Muslims in Western Europe, especially in Britain, where we probably have the most assertive Muslims in Western Europe, is partly this kind of oppositional identity. People saying, well, if you won't allow me to be part of your society, if you constantly point to me as different, then yes, I am different, and now this is your problem. You have to live with my difference. So then we do have the kind of problem that you were talking about. But again, I don't think this can just be put on the minorities. How a majority society opens itself up or fails to open itself up, displays hospitality or displays exclusivity, that is a much bigger factor in the kind of identity crisis you were talking about than any other.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure. Thank you for your penetrating analysis. One can listen to your explanation for hours, and I'm sure that the number of those who wanted to ask questions show that they were very much interested in your explanations. But we have a very prominent speaker.
Yes, in fact, I'd like to thank him for his forbearance and his patience.
Thank you very much.